Hello, my name is John Strand with Black Hills Information Security, and I'm a customer of Scythe, and I wanted to tell you why we are customers of Scythe. Whenever you're doing a red team, a penetration test, or any type of offensive security test, and you're doing it correctly, it requires a massive amount of testing post-exploitation. In particular, mapping those things over to the MITRE ATT&CK technique. What Scythe allows us to do is automate a tremendous amount of those activities so we can get them done quickly instead of doing them manually. And we can get on to research and development and actually tuning our assessments specifically for our customers. So check out scythe.io.
To find out more about Scythe, visit scythe.io/Security Week. Thinkst Canary makes high-fidelity honeypots that set up in minutes and requires no ongoing administration. Attackers moving silently on your network advertise their presence by tripping over them. There's a good reason Thinkst Canaries are deployed and loved by some of the best security teams in the world. They're inexpensive, they're simple, and they work. For more information, go to securityweekly.com/canary or direct message @ThinkstCanary on Twitter. In 2018, ransomware advanced significantly and is now capable of taking out infrastructure and operations across the globe. As a result, many organizations are bogged down in reactive work and often overlook the value of crucial information. In Domain Tools' Threat Intelligence Report, learn how to uncover some of the most critical insights from your organization's alerts and indicators that will allow you to shift to a more proactive posture. To download this white paper, please visit securityweekly.com/domain tools. Welcome, everyone, to this fabulous segment on Paul's Security Weekly. Quick announcement before we get started. Secure World Boston is hosting their 15th annual conference. It will be held March 27th through the 28th at the Heinz Convention Center. Security Weekly listeners do get $100 off if you go to secureworldexpo.com and register using the code SecurityWeekly. Our guest for this segment is Carsten Williams. He's the co-founder and CEO of VMRay. Carsten, welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Paul. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, nice to have you here, Carsten. I wanted to start off with just learning a little bit about your background and how you got into security and ultimately came to found VMRay.
Yeah, great. So actually, I started being interested in security topics when I was 12 or 13, so around 30 years ago, and I was owning a Commodore 64 at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, don't know if that was so popular in the US as well. But
yeah, it was.
In Germany, yeah, it was the #1 computer. Actually, it was not my first computer, but it was my first computer where I started doing programming, and I got so interested in computer viruses. So that was very, very exciting for me. But of course, we didn't have internet at that point in time. Only had floppy disk and stuff like that. And
right.
Yeah, I was very much interested in that topic. However, there was no cybersecurity industry. There was not a lot of peers around myself that were interested in the same topic. So I went some different roads later on. And eventually, when I was working on my diploma thesis in 2006, I came back to the cybersecurity industry because at that point in time, it was actually possible to earn money with doing security solutions, which was not possible years ago, right?
That's awesome. So we talk a little bit about sandboxing, but that's I feel like sandbox is not the right term because I think people have different beliefs on what that term actually means. So Carsten, if you could kind of describe some of the different forms of sandboxing, what it is and what it means, and then we can get into how you're implementing a much different and better sandbox, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the beginning, before sandboxes or before the term sandboxing was used for malware analysis, I mean, the only approach to understanding what a certain binary is doing was static analysis. So you put the sample, put the file into disassembler, into IDA usually, or into a debugger, and try to understand the whole complexity, the whole code, the function calls. I mean, still today, that is the #1 approach if you really want to get all information out of a certain file, just to understand if it's malware, what it's doing, and so on and so forth. However, it's a very, very time-consuming process, and you need a lot of skills for doing reverse engineering. And especially with malware, we see so many protection techniques being used by these files to make it complicated, to make it very hard to really disassemble, to understand, to reconstruct high-level semantics from a file. And because of that, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, more and more people try to come up with approaches to automatically analyze what a certain file can do, what the capabilities of a certain files are. And one approach is so-called behavior-based malware detection. And what you do here is actually you execute an unknown file, but you execute it in a controlled and in an isolated environment, and you lock all activity of that file. So if that file starts creating some files on your hard disk, or if a certain network communication is happening, or if your microphone is activated, all these activities are locked. And after a few minutes, you then get a report, and that report tells you what the capabilities of that certain file are. And very often, you are able to detect malware just by looking at all this recorded behavior. And the term sandbox, I mean, actually, I created a small tool as part of my diploma thesis and called it CWSandbox, which are my initials, CW. And I called it Sandbox. I don't know why. Actually, the term sandbox was not very good, because it's actually not a sandbox. But everybody copied it afterwards, so maybe I'm guilty. Yeah,
and Carsten, to your credit, now that you say CWSandbox, I recognize that tool and didn't put you in connection with the tool. So thank you for your contribution. Awesome. A lot of myself included, a lot of our my friends have used that tool before. So it's awesome.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, we did it at the university, and we made it publicly available so that everybody could use it for free. Later on, it became also a commercial product, and I think it's still on the market under different names because the company got acquired.
Right.
However, it was an academical project, and we learned so much with it, and we got into contact to so many exciting people at that point in time. I think actually the founders of VMRay, they visited us at the university in Mannheim. I was not there at that day, but I think they were also interested in our approach. And of course, when I created CWSandbox, I think the company VMRay already existed, but they didn't have any sandboxing products in their portfolio, at least not that I was aware about. But after that, they really created the market, and they really put that approach to the max, right?
Right. Yeah, and I remember having early conversations about the sandboxing technology, and basically back then it was manual, and then VMRay kind of created that automated process where essentially you'd spin up a VM, you detonate the malware inside of the virtual machine, and you would observe behaviors. And of course, there was a lot of problems with that because malware became more and more self-aware. Correct? And so did that present problems early on?
Yeah. I mean, early on it was not, because since nobody was using behavior-based detection, the malware actors were not aware of that. They didn't put any efforts into detecting sandboxes. But nowadays, the situation is completely different because this behavior-based detection is nowadays part of so many different security products. So most email security products, most web security products, even these endpoint protection AV solutions somehow use sandboxing, usually not on the endpoint, but somewhere in the cloud. But sandboxing is used everywhere. And therefore, malware uses so many different ways to find out if they are being detonated or if they are executed on the real hardware. And I mean, there are some very simple approaches to find out, like checking, for example, if the wallpaper is still the default Windows wallpaper, because that would only happen in an artificial or generic sandbox system. But there are also some very, very complex approaches, like constantly checking the temperature of the CPU, because you can then somehow identify if you're running inside a virtual environment or a real environment. And I mean, I have a 19-minute talk, which I usually give at universities, just on sandbox evasion and what you can do about it. So nowadays it's a big topic, but in the beginning it was not. And there's one funny anecdote, because I mean, usually malware actors and malware vendors are not very smart, and they copy just stuff they found on the internet. And still nowadays I see malware that it's checking the username of the current system and compares it against the value Hans Wurst. And Hans Wurst is a typical German name for an idiot. And at the university in Mannheim, we used Hans Wurst as the username. So 12 years ago, it was possible to detect our sandbox by checking the username. But of course, today that doesn't exist anymore. But we still see that malware, right?
Still see the code. Yeah. And of course, if you're reverse engineering the malware is also has things inside of it that it's like, oh, I'm being reverse engineered, so therefore I'm going to behave differently or do things to crash your debugger and things like that. So over time, it's gotten more and more difficult to do sandboxing or reverse engineering as the threat actors have gotten a lot smarter about it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for sandboxes, the malware usually tries to detect it only. In some cases, and usually, as you mentioned earlier, virtual machines are used to detonate malware. So when it really gets nasty, then the malware does not only to detect the sandbox and don't reveal any malicious activity, but tries to escape the virtual machine. And that is really dangerous, because then you have somewhere in your cert or CSERT environment malware running havoc. In terms of reverse engineering, of course, there are also some exploits that really go against vulnerabilities in debuggers or disassemblers. But usually with reverse engineering or with these anti-reverse engineering techniques, it's only to make it very hard, to make it very complex, to make it time-consuming, to just give you some false hints so that you spend hours or days into deobfuscating or decrypting certain parts of the code that don't really do anything at all, right? So it's a bit different, but in the end, it's all to make it more expensive and to save you some time as a malware. Because if you invest a lot of money into creating an attack, then you want to get the most return on investment, and that means the most time that your malware doesn't get detected by, let's say, signature-based antivirus products or stuff like that.
Right. So when you went to tackle this problem and build a smarter sandbox, what were some of your initial approaches and kind of innovations?
Yeah, so again, I did this 12 years ago for the first time. Then I created different technologies over the years, because as you mentioned, this is an ongoing arms race between the security vendors and the attackers, and every time someone comes up with a new idea how we can better do malware detection or malware analysis, on the next day, the next week, the malware actors came up with a new approach to detect such security products and to evade such security products. So it's an ongoing arms race. And what sandbox vendors usually do is they try to hide their sandbox parts deeper and deeper and deeper into the system. So at the beginning, we were using API hooks, user mode hooks to monitor what is going on in the system, in the sandbox environment. Then we moved that down into the kernel. So we were using kernel hooks, kernel modifications to monitor what is going on. And every time we try to better hide our sandbox parts into the system, again, the malware vendors came up with new ideas to identify it. So VMRay is actually the third technology I created, but also my co-founder Ralf Hund, he did also 2 other sandboxes before. So it's actually an evolution that is going on and on and on.
Yeah, so you've been at this for a long time, Carsten.
It's not that I planned that. So before I did CWSandbox, I was also very much interested in so many other security-related topics. But nowadays, because I became an expert on that one topic, it's not. I would not say I'm bored, but it's. I enjoyed also doing other things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So what we did with VMRay's technology, actually, this was part of our PhD thesis. So eventually, I went back to university and worked on my PhD, because I sold the company that actually marketed CWSandbox. And at the university, I met Ralf Hund, the co-founder and CTO today of VMRay. And we did some things like we for example, we hacked satellite phones, which was really, really a lot of fun. We did some ASLR, kernel ASLR attacks, which was also a lot of fun. But eventually we came back to sandboxing, because it was the end of our PhD, and we said, oh, well, let's build something that we finally can commercialize after our PhD. And then we sat together and thought about, okay, what are the two main drawbacks of existing sandbox products. And the number 2 drawback was that they are too slow, too scalable, not scalable, right? Because it takes minutes to analyze just one file, and we have 100,000 of emails in a bigger organization per day. But the first and the most important drawback of existing sandboxes still today is that they are more and more easy to detect, and we have more and more evasive malware that realizes, well, I'm being executed in a detonation environment and not on a real computer, and therefore don't do anything or just show an error message or just show some benign behavior, so it can't be detected. And that was the point where we said, okay, let's build something that is invisible by design. And also, we were very interested in playing around with these new hardware virtualization features of CPUs. So we combined that we wanted to play around with hypervisors, with let's build something that is invisible. And that is when we came up with that idea to do malware analysis from the hypervisor without the need to use any hooks, any kernel API hooks, any user mode hooks, we do not change any single bit in the environment where we detonate the malware, but from the outside, like an X-ray, we can see what is going on the inside of a virtual machine. Like
Carsten, what's the difference when we think of a traditional virtual machine that's running on something like VMware and a virtual environment that's created using a hypervisor technology?
There's no difference. I would say, hypervisor is just the facility that is used to start a virtual machine. Yeah. So actually, I think the old mainframes, they also were some kind of hypervisors, because we had different execution environments which were sharing the same hardware resources and so on and so forth. The only difference why real hardware virtualization is so important is that 10 years ago, when we used VMware, most of the code was executed on real hardware, but since the Intel processors 10 years ago were not fully supporting hardware virtualization, there still was a lot of emulation involved. And emulation is slow. It's really slow, right? And cloud computing needed scalable and very performant computers. And therefore, the processor vendors added a lot of hardware virtualization features so that no longer any emulation is needed. So you can run 100, 200 virtual machines on one hardware at very, very high performance. And that makes it fast on the one hand, but it also makes it less detectable, because if you don't have to emulate and everything is really running on hardware, then it becomes much, much harder to detect.
So the hypervisors have evolved to use less emulation and make the virtual system appear that's running on actual hardware, not emulating any of the hardware.
Exactly. For cloud computing, it's not that much about detection, because a cloud service wouldn't care. A cloud service would care because it needs virtualization, right? But if you use virtualization for security measures, then it definitely helps us to make it less visible that you're running on a virtual environment.
So it's more difficult for the attacker to figure out that they're running in a virtual environment, because there's no emulation in software, depending on which hypervisor you're running on, right?
Absolutely. Nowadays, malware still uses detection methods in which they try to find out if they're running in a virtualized environment or not. But that is no longer a big issue today, because we have a lot of customers at VMRay, like from the finance sector, where every single workstation is already virtualized, right? So if the malware would refuse to execute or to detonate in a virtualized environment, everybody would be happy eventually, because everybody uses virtualization. Actually, there are these companies like Minerva, for example. They have this vaccination. So it's just a small tool you execute on your computer, and it makes your computer look like a virtual machine, like a sandbox, like it is infected with so many different malware. So when the next malware comes into your computer, it realizes, well, this is an infected machine. This is a sandbox. This is a virtual environment. Don't detonate, right? So VM detection is not that big issue anymore, but still, we see that a lot, because I mentioned it already earlier. Malware vendors or malware actors are really lazy. Most of them are pretty stupid. They just copy code from the internet, and that's why they still do VM detection, right?
Now, it's one thing, so you've created this virtual environment, right? And you're detonating malware inside of it. I think the real value from the customer's perspective is how do you collect telemetry about the malware, right? So you need to know what to look for once the malware is detonated. So what types of things are you looking for once it executes?
Yeah, that's interesting, because this is also where we only learned afterwards that VMRay's approach is so much better than traditional sandbox, but we didn't have that actually in mind. So what a sandbox usually does, it intercepts all the activity between the operating system and the malware, right? Because every time the malware wants to do something harmful or wants to do something persistent, it somehow has to use the operating system to say access the file system, access the registry, use the network interface. So every time when something meaningful is happening, the operating system has to be called for that, right? Because only the operating system has access to the hardware. I mean, this is a bit different for kernel malware, because if you are inside the kernel, you can directly access the hardware resources. Nevertheless, usually we don't see less and less kernel hardware. Also, a kernel hardware usually starts with a user mode malware. So let's just focus on user mode. So what happens when you monitor the activities of a malware is you monitor the interaction between a certain process and the operating system. So that every time when a certain file is created or when a certain registry key is accessed, then the execution of the malware is stopped just for a short amount of time, and the sandbox takes notes. Okay, this file is created with these permissions and so on and so forth, and then the malware is continued. And to that end, usually a sandbox monitors or intercepts, let's say, 250, 300 different APIs, because I mean, there are much more. The operating system or a typical Windows 10 machine offers more than 100,000 APIs, but many of these APIs are not related to any security events. So you don't care if the malware tries to change the color of a pixel of your screen, or you don't care if the malware converts something from ASCII to white char or something. So you take a look at all the different APIs that the operating system provides, and then you say, okay, this one is security relevant, this one is security relevant, and you intercept those. However, this is what you usually do, and you place hooks into the operating system, so that every time when a certain API or a certain system activity is invoked by the malware, you stop it and you take a note. At VMRay, we do something else. We don't hook specific APIs, but we monitor the whole interaction of malware and the operating system by using certain virtualization features that you can use to control the memory and how the memory is used. And that means we monitor everything. So we monitor every single API, we monitor every sys call, we monitor every native call. If you have a Java malware, we monitor Java. So it's super generic. And it was not our intention, but afterwards we learned we provide so much more insight, because you can actually see all the string operations that a malware is doing, and you can see how a bot is encrypting stuff before it sends over the network, and so on and so forth.
So Carsten, you're monitoring more at the hypervisor level than the operating system level?
I mean, you could do the same as we do from hypervisor also when sitting inside the operating system, but it would be so damn slow, and it would be so much more visible, because if you change 120,000 APIs in a system, it's much more easy to detect than just having 250 modified APIs in a system, right?
Right. Yeah, so you're at in some cases a deeper level than the operating system or kernel, because you have insights into the hypervisor, right?
Yeah, it's ring -1, right?
Gotcha.
And if you have more power than someone else, and you can do more, because usually if you have there are some sandboxes which just operate in ring 3, and if you are in ring 3, you don't have more privileges than any malware. That means while you can monitor the malware can also monitor you. Even the malware can deactivate the sandbox, and therefore usually we try to go deeper. So we monitor user mode malware from kernel mode, but then again you lose some semantics, because in kernel land everything is very low level. You don't have any high level semantics, and so on and so forth. But since we have moved into ring -1, we have, it's more or less like God mode, because we are more powerful than the operating system itself, and that helps.
Right, absolutely. How do I get malware into VMRay? I know there's a lot of email is a very common way, right? If there's an email attachment, it's very easy to take that attachment and send it off to a sandbox. But in your case, like, what's your recommendations for your clients to get their potential malware into your sandbox to do the analysis?
Yeah, so we started as a standalone point product vendor where we sold our solutions only to the certs and C-certs of very large organizations or government agencies and so on and so forth. And that was good because these people are super smart. They understand so much about security. We don't have to provide much support, and also presenting our solutions and pitching is pretty easy because usually they already have a sandbox in place and they just can compare our thing against what they already have. And then if you compare one malware detonation from one sandbox to another, it's very often pretty obvious where the value and the advantages lie.
Right.
So we started as a standalone vendor, and in that scenario, our users were either manually uploading files because they had an incident inside the organization and they had to find out, okay, what is this particular file doing? Is it really bad? Is it a false positive? Is it the one that I'm looking for? And that was more or less a manual process. Then we offered an API, and we have a lot of customers that have integrated our solutions into their general security workflow. So a lot of our customers are using these SOAR, like the Misto and Phantom, Ayuhu, all these different SOAR solutions. But more and more, we have been asked by our customers, well, we do not only want to use VMRay as part of our CERT, we want to use it as part of our email security, of our web security, of our firewalls or whatever. So more and more, we offered connectors so that you can put VMRay also on top of your existing security email gateway, on top of your existing web proxy. Because still, we want to be an expert solution, and we do not want to build a full-blown email gateway and care about spam and all this commodity AV stuff. So, but we can be used on top as a, let's say, premium security product, right, for really dangerous and sophisticated malware.
Yeah, that's really awesome. And I mean, there's so many solutions now where you end up with the file, right? And those are more and more common. I mean, years ago, I remember that being in things like vulnerability management, right? It would say this process is suspicious, and it would give you the binary. And then from a SOC analyst perspective, it's like, well, what do I do with this? Do I go now take an hour or two and try and reverse engineer it? Do I send it off to the reverse engineering team?
Or weeks.
Right? Days or weeks, right? It goes down in a rabbit hole. Or do I send it to a solution like VMRay and work that into the process? So.
Yeah, I mean, I just learned today that there are a lot of companies, big organizations today that want to get rid of level 1 and level 2 security support because they think having a multi-tier support system for things that are not security is super reasonable, but it's very, really dangerous to leave level 1 people with potential security incidents and they don't get it, and the incident is never escalated to level 3. So we see a lot of automation, we see a lot of these SOR tools being deployed, and that means you have less people taking deeper looks into specific attacks, and you can't do that manually, right? As you just mentioned. I mean, if it's only hours, that's fine, but sometimes it takes days and weeks, even for a very, very skilled person to investigate what a certain file is doing. And of course, if you are very skilled and if you invest a lot of time, then you can always get a better manual analysis from a specific file than using an automated system like a sandbox. However, a sandbox can help you a lot with that process as well. So, for example, we have an IDA plugin. So if you put a file into our sandbox, we will generate a report and we dump processes and stuff like that. And afterwards, you can simply drag and drop that process dump into IDA, and we will annotate everything. And that means you, as a manual investigator, only have to spend minutes to find the right entry point instead of spending hours to find the starting point. So it's a tool still for experts, which can also be used in an automated way for detection. But to be honest, I prefer that expert use case because that is really the stuff that I like. And like
exactly. Yeah, I mean, even open source tools today are giving you binaries. I just did the second iteration of a security onion deployment to have some data to work with for segments for the show. And, I got some suspicious binaries. And, without a sandbox technology, you're left with, okay, I either got to reverse engineer this myself, or I got to send it up to the free, websites. They're going to analyze it for me. The manual process is very time consuming. If you send it up to other, free places, your mileage kind of varies, right? I don't have a really good, if you come out of those two things, I'm not like 100% confident that I can make the decision whether it's benign or whether it's something truly malicious, right? And I think that that's one of the niches that you're solving, is that quickly analyzing this to raise my confidence score to say, is this good or is this bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, these public sandboxes definitely help a lot, especially for people without budget or personal use, right? However, when being used in a commercial or enterprise environment, very often people have concerns with sharing confidential data with some cloud services. You don't know who's operating that. And I mean, in the past, I mentioned that we had that public sandbox when we were running CWSandbox in the early days, and we got a lot of interesting samples. However, these public sandboxes are also used by the malware vendors, right? So they create a malware, they submit it to a public sandbox, they get the report, and then they tune and fine-tune the malware until it gets no longer detected. So it's also a tool for the bad side, right? So, and that is always why, it's a trade-off between value for which side when you have such a public free service, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Yeah, there's nothing that breeds more confidence with me if I'm doing the analysis than I actually detonated this somewhere and something looked at what it did and then told me, what it did and whether it was good or bad. So I've got some binaries that I want to send you, Carsten. Could you throw those up in one of your sandboxes and send me the report? That would be awesome. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I go to or potential customers, and I mean, a sandbox is not a silver bullet. It's a very, very effective approach. It's complementary to endpoint protection. It's complementary also to some these fancy AI ML based approaches. But if you are doing serious business, you definitely should also involve a sandbox. However, it's not a silver bullet. So sometimes it just doesn't work. I mean, marketing will tell you something different, but I'm coming from academics, so it's much harder to evade or detect VMRay technology than everything else I have seen so far, but it's not impossible. And therefore, it's always very, I would say, exciting when I go to potential customers and pitch our products, and then we come to the live demo, and then I tell them, okay, I brought some malware, but it's easy for a vendor to analyze malware that he already knows and that he already prepared for. So just give me some USB devices from your daily practice, and we'll analyze it. And usually it works. I mean, sometimes it doesn't work for whatever reasons, but usually it works. And this is very, I mean, this creates confidence when this really works in a live demo and it's not a pre-recorded one, right?
Right. It seems that enterprises today are more and more moving their infrastructure and services to the cloud, right, as an all-encompassing term. Also, a lot of organizations build their own clouds, and then some still prefer to run some things on-premise. When I use VMRay, like, what are my options for deployment?
Yeah, the world is pretty easy for VMRay. So I would say nearly all of our American customers use our cloud offering, and nearly all of our non-American customers use our on-prem offering. So it's I mean, there are always exceptions, and also in Europe and also in Germany, we see these shift towards cloud. But still, I think we are some years behind the States in terms of adoption. And when I go to the Middle East, for example, at least my personal impression is that they are a few years behind Europe when it comes to adoption of, in general, but also to cloud measures. So we are, I mean, since we are originally a German company, we already before GDPR had very strict rules on privacy and on confidentiality. So we host all our servers in Germany. Now with GDPR, things are a bit easier for everyone. So it's I mean, everybody hates GDPR, but now we have at least the European Union also made the others suffer and not only us, right? So that's good for GDPR.
Yeah, I think it's certainly got some good and bad, right? That came out of. I think now we can look at it and say, well, at least for me, some of the good is I can go to some of the major providers of social media and whatever and download all my data, and that's pretty cool, right? But obviously, there's I have to become compliant with it, so there's a cost involved with that for all companies across the world, as you alluded to. So that's awesome. Carsten, talk a little bit about some of your integrations, right? Because I feel like every enterprise, I don't know if that you'd find two enterprises that have all of the same security tools in their portfolio, right? And so when it comes to right? So when it comes to integrations, you have to make decisions. So what are some of your kind of more popular integrations?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I just said earlier before we started the show that I was at RSA conference last week, and there was 753 different security vendors on the expo, right? 753, and they are all doing more or less the same. So it's impossible for a client to actually decide what is the right solution for you. And we don't see that diversity when we go into enterprises, but still we see a lot of diversity. So we have some generic integrations, so you can use VMRay as part of your email gateway, no matter of what security actually or what solution you actually are using. And we also have an ICAP integration with proxies, which supports a lot of different products. However, having this said, we also have more than 25 out of the box integrations with specific security products. And now, what's the strategy on how to pick? I mean, if someone comes to us and says, well, we have this security product and we want to build an integration or a connector, and we do all the work, then yes, do it. I mean, I don't have any concern with that. If we are the one that has to do the heavy lifting, and it's usually not a heavy lifting, because integrating a sandbox is pretty straightforward. It's usually just two APIs. Send a file and give me back the result. It's not so complicated. Nevertheless, we decide usually if we have to do the heavy lifting, then we only do it on demand. So if a certain customer tells us, well, we use Splunk, we use Demisto, we use Carbon Black, whatever, then we build that integration on our own. Something that also is seen very often is the integration, the threat intel sharing platform MISP. I don't know if you are familiar with that.
No.
I think it started as a project from the government of Luxembourg. It's a platform where different companies from one vertical or from different vertical, or even certain entities of one company can share their threat intel with. And it started in Luxembourg, then more and more European customers, also enterprise customers, not only government organizations, ask us for an integration. But nowadays, even on calls with American customers, I hear MISP quite often. So I think MISP is a very, very popular connector that we provide.
That's awesome. Now, if our audience is interested in learning more, how does it work? I'm assuming because attackers would take advantage of this if they had access to it, that there's some kind of validation that you do before someone can access it and engage with you and stuff like that.
Yeah, we do a very, very, very thorough background check. You have to send us your personal ID and stuff like that. No, of course not. I mean, we in the beginning when we didn't already had VMRay, we tried to do some tests of competitive products, and we found it sometimes very, very hard to just try out something, right?
Yeah,
so.
Yeah.
Today we just don't need that anymore, and we get so much information from all different of our peers. Actually, I know most of the technology people in all these other competitive product companies, so I don't need that anymore. But I mean, the POC, usually when we get approached by companies, we do a POC on our cloud. It's not that we ship hardware. It's not that we ship software. We make it very easy for the customer, make it very easy for us. So we do some background check in terms of, is this really a legit company? And usually we also require that the testers of our solution give their company email addresses and not their Gmail and so on and so forth. But it's not very complicated.
Right.
And actually, we don't do security by obscurity, so we don't have anything to hide. It's just a technology that is pretty invisible and robust by design. And it's not that someone really can take a look at our solution, really can make a lot of use in exploiting it afterwards, right?
Right. Yeah, that's cool. Carsten, thank you so much for coming on the show. And those that are interested and want to learn more, you can visit securityweekly.com/VMRay. From there, we'll post some content, including this interview and other such information. And that can start you on your journey to requesting a free trial from VMRay. So, Carsten, again, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Paul, thanks a lot. It was very nice talking to you. Bye.
You too. Thank you. And that will conclude this episode of Paul Security Weekly. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Over and out.